face of global challenges, as well as to optimize mandates within the UN system. Madam President, 1 year ago, before this prestigious assembly, as the President of the Transition of the Republic of Gabon, I presented the political process begun in my country after the liberation coup which took place on August 30th, 2023. After the presidential election of April 12th, 2025, for which the process and outcomes were unanimously endorsed by the international community, this transition culminated with my inauguration on May 3rd, 2025, as the first elected president of the Gabonese Republic, thus establishing the foundations of democratic order. As you know, Gabon has undergone a peaceful and exemplary transition that included all of the political parties in our nation. This
smooth transition led to an inclusive national dialogue and a constitutional referendum in accordance with the agreed-upon timelines, and it will continue through the holding of legislative, local, and senatorial elections that are free and transparent. To this end, the first and second round of combined legislative and local elections will take place on September 27th and October 11th, 2025. With regard to the election of senators, this will take place on November 8th, and the second round is scheduled for November 29th, 2025.
With a view toward a definitive restoration of constitutional order by January 2026. We believe that this peaceful and historic process can serve as a lesson and a model in many other spheres. The people of Gabon have drawn this success from its history, its culture of peace, and its shared vision of the future. Here I would like to express, on behalf of the Gabonese people and on my own behalf, our sincere gratitude to the United Nations for its multifaceted assistance. I know that I can count on the support of the UN as we implement our National Growth and Development Plan. This plan focuses on bolstering our energy capacity, on strengthening infrastructure, developing the digital sector, and on enhancing youth employment. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabon is standing before you again with a clear message. Our country has changed. After decades of tensions and political and economic missteps, the Gabonese people has chosen the path of reconciliation and renewal, thus becoming the symbol of and testament to the transformation of hardship into hope, of dependency into dignity, of division into unity, and all without bloodshed. Today, Gabon is no longer a country in limbo. It has returned to stand alongside other states, upright, dignified, and ready to take up its rightful place in the community of nations. The new Gabon, the exemplary Gabon that my compatriots are calling for, also means that the state in Gabon must serve its people from now on. But our national rebirth would be futile without a change in the international order. It is no longer acceptable for African nations to remain relegated to the role of providers of raw materials for which others set the price and from which others profit. Therefore,
I would like to invite public and private investors
to support us through win-win partnerships. We have decided to process our resources on our territory, to create jobs at home, to develop African industries, and to interact with the world on the basis of equity, integrity, and mutual respect as we strive toward happiness. In its path toward development, Gabon, a country of peace and opportunity, will continue to welcome all those who commit to upholding our laws, our Republican values, and to contributing positively to our national rise. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this 80th session of the General Assembly has the theme, Better Together, 80 Years and More for Peace, Development, and Human Rights. It takes place in an international context characterized by economic, environmental, and security crises that call for more sustained and more staunch collective engagement. This is an urgent call to tackle these concerns in accordance with the spirit and the values of the UN Charter. Has a radically different face. Humanity has never had so much technological prowess to ensure its well-being, and yet international peace and security have never seemed so fragile and so under threat. It is high time that peace reign on earth, and especially in Africa, which has so long suffered under conflicts that have been stoked and financed from outside the continent. Let the guns at last fall silent in the DRC, in Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, and in the Sahel. In this regard, instead of constantly stigmatizing and condemning the states of the Sahel, the international community would benefit from supporting them in their battle against the many-headed threat of terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, on December 12, 1988, Gabon officially recognized the State of Palestine. Then, as now, we support the two-state solution, the only way, in accordance with UN resolutions, to guarantee a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as to guarantee international security. In this vein, Gabon must reaffirm its position in favor of lifting the embargo imposed on Cuba due to its negative effect on the well-being of Cuba's people. We solemnly reaffirm our full support for international efforts carried out throughout the world to achieve peace. These efforts must be centered on humans, especially women and youth. Through the Pact for the Future of 2024, the UN must continue to encourage and support the crucial action of women, stemming from the Declaration and the Beijing Declaration and Program of Action, of which we're celebrating the 30th anniversary this year. Madam President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution is an existential threat for humanity. And yet, the efforts of the international community to address these challenges remain drastically inadequate. The Treaty on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions, which we have just ratified, fills a legal gap and provides an ambitious framework for equitable and sustainable governance of biodiversity. Together, we have a real opportunity to make this treaty a true driver of transformation for present and future generations. Gabon is the guardian of part of the Congo Basin, the second largest green lung of our planet. This extraordinary heritage must not be sacrificed to financial rapacity. We call for an equitable global partnership in which the protection of our forests is accompanied by fair compensation for the ecological services these forests provide to humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, the new global order is underway. The changes taking place in our societies are inevitable and cannot be overlooked. International peace and justice can only be guaranteed by a revitalized multilateralism, in particular through Security Council reform that takes into account the African claims enshrined in the Sirte Declaration and the Eswatini Consensus, to which Gabon is firmly committed. I wish every success to our work, and I wish a happy birthday to our organization. Thank you.
I thank you and happy birthday to all of us. On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Gabonese Republic, Head of State and Head of Government. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At this 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I'd like to speak about Africa's role in the future of this organization. However, it's impossible to do that without first considering the collective role that Africa played in its founding, which was small and relatively insignificant. Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. It is important to point out that the United Nations came into being in the aftermath of World War II because of the inability of its predecessor, the League of Nations, to avert a large-scale global conflict, which had been its guiding purpose when it was founded in 1920 at the end of the First World War. Out of the 42 founding member states of the League of Nations, only 3 were African: Liberia, the Union of South Africa, and Ethiopia. Egypt was to join later in 1937. Africa's overall participation in the organization's founding was minimal and relatively unimportant. That's because before all the other talks and meetings, representatives from a group of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a series of discussions that began in 1884 and which led to the partitioning and formal colonization of the African continent, which is also called the Scramble for Africa. It has famously been written that past is prologue. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, More than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. Already today, Africa is a catalyst for human potential and development, as well as for economic reform and ecological stability. Africa is a catalyst for systemic change. If this reality, which is fact-based and straightforward, seems provocative or unsettling, perhaps it's because you are viewing it through the lens of centuries of filters, colonialism and imperialism, and the resulting implicit bias. Maybe you are unaware of the resilience of African nations or their remarkable ability to make a strong comeback just when you think it's safe to count them out. That is what is happening right now in my own country, Ghana. Our constitution limits leaders to 2 4-year terms. In January, I was sworn in for a second term, which, let me point out, was non-consecutive with my first term. Our currency, the Ghana cedi, was rapidly depreciating, faced with rising inflation, a huge debt burden, and low morale amongst our citizens. My new administration settled down quickly and embarked on an ambitious program of comprehensive transformation designed to restructure Ghana's economic foundation and enhance our competitive standing globally. We refer to this process of recalibration as our reset agenda. In just 8 months, we have achieved significant reduction in inflation from 23.8% in December 2024 to 11.5% in August 2025, restoring price stability for our citizens. Additionally, our currency, the Ghana cedi, has appreciated considerably against other currencies, with Bloomberg reporting it as the best performing currency in the world at one point. Our improved sovereign credit rating reflects increasing investor confidence in our economy, and our 24-hour economy initiative promises to transform our economy. And there's a renewed willingness amongst our people to trust that their elected officials have Ghana's interests at heart and that we're progressing together. Madam President, I believe that in honor of this milestone celebration, the United Nations should also embark on a process of serious recalibration and establish its own reset agenda. Since the organization's founding, the number of UN member nations has nearly quadrupled. And quite frankly, it is not the same world that it was back then when the UN was formed. I mentioned earlier that I began my second non-consecutive term as president this past January. My first term ended in January 2017. In that span of time, 8 years, the world has changed with such ferocity. My first days in office after my return felt as though I had just awakened from a Rip Van Winkle-style sleep. Now, no, that was only after 8 years. Imagine then what it will be like after 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. In 1945, the sun had not yet set on the largest empire in history. The most common mode of international travel was by sea. The personal computer had not been invented, let alone made portable. And television, a new convenience, was still in its infancy, albeit in black and white color. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union were turning frosty, with Winston Churchill declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. Fast track 80 years on. In today's world, hundreds of thousands of commercial flights take off and land every day. Libraries have been digitized so that volumes of literature can exist on a small device, small enough to fit inside your pocket. We live in a world of cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, social media, the internet and its dark hidden dungeon of the dark web, all of which carry a potential threat to global peace and security. Climate change is real. and we're fighting a losing battle against the loss of Maldives and other island nations to the rising sea level, against the loss of Timbuktu to desertification and the Amazon forest to global warming and deforestation. Madam President, the UN Founding Charter is outdated when it comes to representation in this August Assembly. The most powerful post-World War II nations are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And yet, the first sentence in Chapter 2, Article 1 of the UN Charter declares that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. If this were true, and was the case, a continent as large as Africa, with its numerous UN member states, would have at least one permanent seat on the Security Council. Furthermore, we believe that veto power should not be restricted to only 5 nations, nor should it be absolute. There must be a mechanism in this House for the General Assembly to challenge a veto. No single nation should be able to exercise an absolute veto to serve its own interests in a dispute. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot, and he said, "The United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general and the Security Council in particular." I close quotations. 30 years later, we African leaders are still making the same simple request for a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power of a veto. So today, Madam President, I stand here in this exact spot and ask the world, if not now, then when? We demand not only a reform of the Security Council, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions. And while I'm making requests, I'd like to call for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our nation's founder, famously said, "We seek to be friends with all and enemies to none." The Cuban people shed their blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid. And indeed, Cuba has been and continues to be a faithful friend of Africa. You see, the very fact that I can stand here and ask these things and say these things, and the fact that all nations can ostensibly gather here to address critical global issues, air our grievances, and express our concerns, that is what makes the survival of this organization so important. In every old city or village, you will find a town square, or a courtyard, or a plaza that once served as a gathering space for the citizens of the community and their leaders. Meetings and celebrations were held there, as were trials and elections. And these were spaces that brought people together and held them together as a community. Sadly, time and technology have eroded these spaces. Madam President, in many ways, the United Nations is the proverbial town square of our modern global village. And it has never been more critical for us to protect this one space that brings and holds the world nations together as a community. The internet, social media platforms, and artificial intelligence offer us the illusion of connectivity, when in fact what they do is reinforce isolation by using algorithms that ensure that we do not receive new ideas and perspectives, but rather more of the same content. We are served alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations. Ghana recognized the state of Palestine in 1988 and supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop. The crimes in Gaza must stop. Madam President, I also want to draw particular attention to the conflict in Sudan, which this body has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 12 million people have had to flee their homes. And when we speak of migration, we refer to the 12 million new Sudanese refugees, whom we as a global community should be willing to assist in much the same way that many member nations readily assisted new refugees coming out of Ukraine. Let's dispense with the euphemisms and dog whistles and speak frankly. It is not a mystery that when leaders of Western nations complain of their migration problems, they are often referring to immigrants from the global south. But many of those immigrants are climate refugees. And interestingly, the global north emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. However, the effects of climate change are more severe in the global south because we lack the resources to address them effectively. And so when the desert encroaches on our villages and towns and they become unlivable, we are forced to flee. Warsan Shire, a Somali-born prophet, a Somali-British poet born in Kenya to Somalian refugee parents, was London's first youth poet laureate. She writes in her poem titled Home. And it says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one bends their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than just a journey. Madam President, we cannot normalize cruelty. We cannot normalize hatred. We cannot normalize xenophobia and racism. If we're going to tell a story, let's not tell it slant. Let's tell all the truth. When we speak of migrants, we speak of Mami Ewusi Mensah Frimpong, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. She's the first black female judge on any of California's 4 federal district courts. She was born here in America to immigrant parents from Ghana. We speak of Peter Bosman, a medical doctor in Ghana who moved to the town of Piran in Slovenia in the 1980s and later became the first black mayor of Piran, the first black mayor in Slovenia and in the whole of Eastern Europe. We speak of T. Michael, the iconic Ghanaian Norwegian artist and designer. And of course, we speak of the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was born in Ghana but spent his adulthood in various places in America and Europe. These are people who have brought great distinction to the countries that they decided to call home. Just as the migrants and the children of migrants before them did, I dare say these are not invaders. These are not criminals. Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resources, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property, in quotes, and that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed. Madam President, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. Since July 2024, it is estimated that there's been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid globally. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities. Allow me to echo the Indian-American writer Arundhati Roy, who wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her briefing." I want to add that for the sake of Africa, and quite selfishly for the sake of my 18-year-old daughter, I hope that this new world that is arriving is a place of safety and equality for women and girls. To succeed, we must empower everyone, including women and girls, to reach their full potential. In closing, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate you on your election to preside over this historic 80th General Assembly and on being the 5th woman to hold this distinction. I'd also like to congratulate Her Excellency Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman on being the first woman Vice President of Ghana. Now every Ghanaian girl knows the heights to which she can ascend. Words matter, but issues of representation matter even more, which is why Ghana looks forward to the appointment of a woman as Secretary General of this organization in the near future. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ghana. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Omaho O.C. Sokam Embalo, President of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, distinguished heads of state and government, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin by congratulating Mrs. Annalena Barbok on her election as President of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I thank the outgoing President, Mr. Philemon Yang, for his service to the international community. To Secretary General Antonio Guterres, I wish to reaffirm Guinea-Bissau's full support for his tireless efforts in favor of world peace, international cooperation, multilateralism, and sustainable 80 years ago, the founders of the United Nations pledged to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That promise, unfortunately, has not yet been fully fulfilled. Yet this commitment, undertaken by each member state upon joining the UN Charter, remains valid and continues to be honored through the dedication of every UN peacekeeper and every humanitarian worker who often make the difference between life and death in conflict zones or following natural disasters. UN agencies such as WHO, UNESCO, UNICEF, FAO, WFP, UNHCR, and UNDP, among others, provide treatment, education, vaccines, food, and protect every day millions of human beings and contribute to the fight against poverty and discrimination against women and girls all over the world. The United Nations remains relevant, especially in these times of deep global uncertainty and crisis. It continues to be the only forum where all nations, large and small, have a seat and a voice. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world confronted by multiple crises. We are witnessing what Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called polycrisis. Conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and other regions persist. Socioeconomic inequalities, environmental shocks, political instability, and humanitarian emergencies disproportionately affect developing countries, with the greatest impact on small island developing states. Progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals has slowed significantly or even stalled. The sovereign debt burden of poor countries is increasing, while development assistance is declining. Guinea-Bissau welcomes the UNGA80 initiative, and we hope it will contribute to strengthening the organization, especially in promoting peace, international security, and the achievement of the SDGs. The Pact for the Future offers a roadmap and an action plan that must not remain on paper. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, last July, Guinea-Bissau hosted the 15th Conference of Heads of State and Government of the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries, CPLP. I have taken on the presidency of the CPLP for the 2025-2027 term. The CPLP places high importance on its cooperation with the United Nations and its specialized agencies. During our term, we will continue to work with all partners and multilateral organizations toward the implementation of global commitments, especially concerning the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the 3rd UN Ocean Conference, and the 4th UN Conference on Financing for Development, held last June-July in Seville. We are convinced that two major international meetings scheduled for November, namely COP30 in Belém, Brazil, and the 2nd World Summit for Social Development in Doha, Qatar, will serve as key platforms and opportunities to strengthen our cooperation and to advance our shared goals. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Guinea-Bissau is scheduled to hold presidential and legislative elections on the 23rd of November this year. All necessary conditions are being put in place to ensure that these elections are held peacefully, freely, transparently, and credibly. Over the past 5 years, I have prioritized dialogue, inclusion, political stability, and the consolidation of the democratic rule of law. I am confident that these upcoming elections will reaffirm the irreversible nature of citizenship and democratic values in Guinea-Bissau. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude by saying that in an increasingly interdependent world, we need, now more than ever, a world order grounded in the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, in respect for international law and in peaceful coexistence. In this regard, Guinea-Bissau reiterates our call for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo and other forms of restrictions imposed on Cuba. 80 years after the creation of the United Nations, the world has changed. We are no longer just the 51 countries who signed the UN Charter in 1945. Today, the United Nations is all of us, the 193 member states, plus observer states, NGOs, civil society organizations, and other actors represented in this great assembly hall. To meet the challenges of the 21st century, the UN must undertake urgent reforms, reforms that reflect today's geopolitical realities and global power balances, reforms that expand and democratize the Security Council, reforms that provide a place and a voice to the Global South, reforms that restore confidence in the multilateralism and international cooperation. The UN continues to be a unique multilateral space where dialogue is still possible, even when diplomacy and good offices fail elsewhere and in other circumstances. The legitimacy, strength, and future of the UN lie in the inclusion and full participation of all of us in deliberations and decision-making. Its core details, peace, dignity, equality, poverty eradication, cooperation, and peaceful resolution of conflicts remain alive and continue to inspire the purposes of the international community and the March of Humanity. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. The Assembly will hear an address by His Majesty King Musawati III, Head of the State of the Kingdom of Eswatini. I request protocol to escort His Majesty and invite him to address the Assembly.
Your Excellency, Madam President of the General Assembly, Your Majesties, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, UN Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to address the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly under the theme Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development, and human rights. At the outset, we wish to assure you, Madam President, of Eswatini's unwavering support during your tenure. We also commend the UN Secretary General and the Secretariat for their steadfast leadership in navigating our world through unprecedented challenges. As we gather today, mankind is confronted with many challenges, including conflicts around the world. We must remind ourselves that when the United Nations was established in 1945, it was during a time of widespread global strife. Its founding fathers resolved that no country or people should endure suffering due to conflict. The UN Charter and structure were designed to be clear and resolute. Now is the time to ask ourselves what has gone wrong and what steps must be taken to correct these challenges and restore the UN's mission of fostering peace. The question we must ask ourselves further is, what is the UN doing to address these issues effectively? I propose that the United Nations establishes ad hoc committees to tackle global conflicts and promote peace. These committees should have equitable representation in dealing with the relative conflicts in the diverse regions of hotspots, including Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and beyond, ensuring that all affected nations have a voice. Supported by the Secretariat of the United Nations, these ad hoc committees would visit conflict zones, engage with local communities, and work towards peaceful resolutions. For instance, in Africa, the conflicts in Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, the Sahel, and the Great Lakes need the intervention of these ad hoc committees. In the Middle East, they should facilitate dialogue with all parties involved. The team could ask the Palestinians what it will take to release the hostages, given the fact that the Israelis would remain aggrieved as long as their loved ones are not with them. Similarly, the ad hoc committee should engage the Israelis to ascertain what it will also take for them to stop the bombardment, to avoid loss of more innocent lives, widespread destruction of property, and a growing refugee crisis. By engaging directly with the affected communities, these communities could help broker solutions that address the concerns of all sides to reduce tensions, suffering, and foster stability. In the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, these ad hoc committees could mediate discussions to identify pathways to peace. Their role would be to engage in meaningful dialogue and report back to the United Nations with actionable recommendations on what it would take to end the war. In Eswatini, we encourage that yield positive outcomes proving that dialogue is the cornerstone in nation building. We thank those countries already making means in finding solutions. This suggested approach is not meant to undermine their efforts, but it would complement them as they are already working towards peaceful resolutions. We must avoid actions that could escalate tensions further and instead focus on saving innocent lives. Millions of lives have already been lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore cannot afford to lose any more to conflict. The UN must now focus on supporting the building of economies of the world to address issues of poverty and the global financial crisis which we experienced after the COVID-19 pandemic. By investing in these areas, we can create conditions for lasting peace. We therefore need one another in building and supporting our development initiatives in our respective countries. The time for action is now. The UN was established in pursuit of international law and peace, and its mandate dates back decades. In 2025 and onwards, we must renew our commitment to this mission by forming these ad hoc committees and making informed, inclusive decisions. We can work towards a world where peace prevails and no nation or people suffer needlessly. We have been calling for the restructuring of the United Nations as a body representing all member states. It must lead with decisions that are inclusive and widely respected, as no one will question the process taken. These reforms should be fully representative of all countries through the regions of the world in the Security Council to create an all-inclusive structure. Without such reform, the legitimacy and effectiveness of this body will remain incomplete. We have been encouraged to witness UN high-level meetings prior to the General Assembly being held to address various issues. These include the Seville and Awaza declarations on financing for development and socio-economic challenges faced by landlocked countries. We are aware that for any growth to take place, nations must have enough resources to achieve sustainable development goals. As we convene to advance international cooperation and to uphold human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, we are reminded that our work is both urgent and indispensable. The theme Better Together underscores the imperative of delivering on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and reinvigorating global cooperation. Eswatini continues to believe that working together remains our most powerful tool for addressing global challenges that transcend borders. The world stands at a critical juncture in pursuit of Agenda 2030. With only 5 years remaining, we must face the reality that progress on the SDG is far off track. This is a sobering reminder that our collective efforts must be redoubled and that international solidarity, cooperation, and shared responsibility are more urgent than ever before. Through my national call to all Eswatini, to all Emaswati of Ngwe, for a greater sense of agency in the pursuit of sustainable development, the Kingdom has made important strides in advancing Agenda 2030, particularly in the areas of the economy, in various sectors, health, education, and gender equality, to mention a few. Furthermore, Furthermore, the country's literacy rates have improved, reflecting our investments in education, while the nation continues to be empowered through targeted programs that strengthen their role in our society and economy. These achievements demonstrate what is possible when determination and partnership come together. While we have witnessed the GDP growth of our economy, we remain with a number of challenges to address, and we count on the UN for support to become one of the advanced economies of the world. We have implemented initiatives to grow our economy and attract new investments by opening trade opportunities with other countries that give access to regional and international markets. Your Excellencies, the global economy remains fragile. Persistent inflation resulting in rising food and energy prices, as well as tightening financial conditions, have eroded fiscal space for many developing nations. Across sub-Saharan Africa, countries spend on average 12% of government revenues on debt servicing, diverting resources urgently needed for social cohesion programs. Eswatini also advocates for trade facilitation and economic diversification, simplifying customs procedures, reducing regulatory barriers, and enabling greater participation in regional and global value chains. In this regard, the African Continental Free Trade Area has the potential to boost intra-Africa trade by up to 52%, drive industrialization, and create millions of jobs. For countries like Eswatini, the AfTA offers more than market access. It provides a pathway to overcome geographic constraints through regional integration, cooperation, and efficient trade corridors. In an increasingly connected world, the Kingdom of Eswatini is actively striving for digital transformation as a catalyst for sustainable development. Eswatini is open for business in technology and looks forward to partnering and sharing experiences with other developed countries in advancing our technologies. Eswatini is proud of the significant progress achieved under Sustainable Development Goal 3. We welcome the progress made in the ratification of the Pandemic Treaty. This landmark agreement is essential for strengthening preparedness and resilience against future health emergencies, fostering effective and equitable cooperation. We remain deeply concerned about the decline in bilateral and multilateral support for global health priorities. Weakening our joint efforts threatens to erode decades of progress in this sector, as health is a global security. The Kingdom of Eswatini recognizes that the increasing frequencies and intensity of natural disasters, emergencies, and protracted crises highlight the urgent need for integrated responses that bridge humanitarian relief, long-term development, and peace building. We urgently need to strengthen disaster preparedness, build resilient communities, and integrate emergency responses with sustainable development. Eswatini, like other countries in the region, has many young and marginalized groups who face unemployment and inequality in various sectors. Ensuring empowerment, capacity building, and employment is our priority, and with the support of the UN programs, we are taking deliberate steps to provide a more enabling environment to guarantee their future. We equally recognize the rights and potential of persons with disabilities who continue to face disproportionate barriers to education, employment, and social participation so that they can fully contribute to and benefit from national development. The United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758, adopted in 1971, did not address the issue of Taiwan's representation in the United Nations, and it does not preclude their participation in the UN system. The United Nations must seek suitable ways of including Taiwan
so that she can better contribute to realizing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In that way, this will fulfill the UN mandate to ensure that no country is left behind.
Madam President, in conclusion, we are entrusted with the hopes of our people and the future of our children. Let us not leave this assembly without reaffirming our commitment to justice, peace, and sustainable progress for all. The Kingdom of Eswatini stands ready to play its part. The international community must remain united in addressing shared global challenges, from hunger and malnutrition to climate change, under the guiding spirit of better together. I thank you. May Almighty God bless us all.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the head of the state of the Kingdom of Eswatini.
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Sonang Jilwept, President of the Republic of Palau. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished guests, delegates, it is my great honor to address this assembly at a milestone moment, the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. 80 years ago, nations scarred by war came together to say, never again. They built this organization on the belief that cooperation, not conflict, could guide humanity forward. Today, as we reflect on that founding vision, let us remember the United Nations was not built for the powerful, but for all nations, large and small. In Palau, we have a saying, "Ndi senson embrari akloes." Small twigs banded together can light the fire that can bring the pot to boil. This wisdom reminds us that even the smallest among us, when united and determined, can drive meaningful change. The recent International Court of Justice advisory opinion affirms this truth, that our voice, though often overlooked, carries the weight of justice. We thank Vanuatu for their leadership and recognize the Pacific youth who co-led this charge. The advisory opinion confirmed that what we have always known. 1.5 degrees is not optional. It is now the benchmark for international law. Let us defend this limit as the political, moral, and legal anchor of the Paris Agreement. The world is at war. Defense spending is at an all-time high, approaching $3 trillion annually. We have many problems. And now more than ever, we need to come together. We are also at war. Our shores are being invaded by seawater. Our homes are being blown away by storms. Our roads are being washed away by torrential rains. Our reefs are overheating. Our fish are disappearing. And our land is on fire. This is our daily battle. And ahead of COP30 in Belém, we must see new nationally determined contributions submitted without delay, particularly from major emitters. And they must be aligned with the 1.5 degree trajectory. We applaud Australia's leadership in setting incredibly ambitious and achievable 2035 emissions reduction targets and developing clear strategies to reach its net zero emissions pathway by 2050. Australia leads the way in supporting Pacific Islands in accelerating the energy transition. This is a testament to the kind of leadership needed to defend and ensure a safe and prosperous future for all. However, ambition without implementation is an empty promise. For SIDS, the fight depends on climate finance. Too often, our countries are trapped in systems that are overly complex, slow, inaccessible. Finance must be predictable and adequate. It should not create new debt. It should free us to implement our NDCs, adapt to climate change impacts, and address loss and damage. The 1.5 degrees Celsius limit remains our lifeline, and finance is the key to achieving it. We need investment, not in defense, but for us to combat our greatest threat, climate change. It is not aspirational. It is the scientifically grounded guardrail that protects the most vulnerable from the worst climate impacts. Madam President, our region has served as the world's moral compass on climate justice. We have helped secure the 1.5 degree goal in Paris. We have pushed for a mechanism on loss and damage. If the world is serious about 1.5, we urge you to come to our region, to see with your own eyes what the Pacific is facing, and be moved to act. That is why COP31 must be a Pacific COP, hosted by Australia, shaped in partnership with the Pacific. Madam President, on the issue of climate solutions, deep sea mining has been incorrectly promoted as a silver bullet for the climate crisis. If we rush forward without understanding the consequences, we risk inflicting irreparable harm. The loss of biodiversity, the release of carbon, damage to our water column, and the destruction of fisheries that sustain our people is unfathomable. At UNGA80, 38 countries, including Palau, came together to support a moratorium, and our message is clear. We must let science guide before we exploit the deep sea. The historic BBNJ agreement enters into force in January. And while Palau is proud to be the first ratifier, we couldn't have lit this fire alone. Like the Palauan proverb of the twigs, crossing the collective effort of over 60 countries demonstrates that we are better together. While we celebrate this achievement, we need even more nations to join this commitment to truly safeguard our ocean's future. Colleagues, the BBNJ agreement presents an unprecedented opportunity to design new ocean governance institutions where SIDS have a voice from the start. We are big ocean states, and we call on our partners, including the EU, to support a SIDS seat in the BBNJ governance structure. Excellencies, the stakes for SIDS could not be higher. Our economies are small, our vulnerabilities are acute, and our physical space is painfully narrow. The Antigua and Barbuda agenda for SIDS gives us a blueprint for resilient prosperity, but it cannot stand without tools. That is why the Seville commitment matters. The world has finally recognized that the financial system cannot be fair if it measures only income and ignores vulnerability. Multilateralism is our only shield, yet too often it is sidelined, blacklisted, and cut off from finance and boxed in by rules we did not write. We demand a seat not as bystanders, but as equal architects of our shared future. We call for the full and immediate integration of the multi-dimensional vulnerability index into the policies and frameworks of international financial institutions, multilateral development banks, and international organizations. It is time that we move the MVI from theory to practice. As we commemorate 80 years of this United Nations, we must look honestly at the strengths and its shortcomings. We welcome the Secretary General's UNGA80 initiative, but let me be clear, reform cannot be cosmetic. This UN must be more responsive, more equitable, and more focused on delivery. Madam President, Palau knows too well the heavy cost of war, having endured the devastation of World War II on our islands. That history reminds us not only of the suffering left in the wake of conflict, but also the sacred value of peace. Palau has always stood for dignity of every human life and for the peaceful resolution of disputes through dialogue and respect for international law. Our positions, whether in support or restraint, are always guided by a deeper purpose, the pursuit of peace that is just, lasting, and stable. We believe that a durable solution, one that envisions two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians living in two democratic states, side by side, in peace and in dignity and security, within mutually recognized borders, is essential for lasting peace. Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine is a stark reminder that when international law is disregarded, peace everywhere is placed at risk. It is only through respect for the rules-based order that all nations, large and small, can live securely. Continuing in that spirit of respect for life and stability, I must raise an important issue of principle. Years ago, China wrongly interpreted UNGA Resolution 2758. And today, it continues to claim that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic. The end result has been Taiwan been silenced. The 23 million people's voices have been kept unheard, keeping Taiwan out of fully participating in the UN system and contributing to the world. Palau believes that inclusivity, which includes Taiwan, strengthens the United Nations, and that no community should be barred from contributing to the solutions of our world that it so desperately needs. Madam President, let me close with another Palauan proverb. It's about tides, dol raidis. An incoming tide should lift everyone. The choices we make together are about lifting all of us, ensuring the next generation inherits a world that sustains them just as it has sustained us. As we face today's greatest challenges, climate change, ocean decline, debt, inequality, wars, and conflict, no nation can carry the weight alone. But together, guided by the spirit of the UN's founding and strengthened by 80 years of hard-learned lessons, we can turn the tide. Let this assembly be remembered not only for the words we speak, but for the actions we take and for the resilience we build, the justice we uphold, and the future we secure for the generations yet to be born. We are better together. God bless you. Sulang, thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Palau. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Ilhamu Haydar Ogolo Aliu, President of the Republic of Azerbaijan. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Ladies and gentlemen, for many years I spoke from this tribune about tragedies of aggression, occupation, and injustice experienced by Azerbaijan. Today I will speak about our long road to victory and peace, and a new era in Azerbaijan's history, about how we managed to end the occupation through a liberation war and how we won peace by political means. For nearly 3 decades, almost 20% of Azerbaijan's sovereign territory remained under military occupation by Armenia. 1 million of Azerbaijanis were expelled from their homes as a result of the policy of ethnic cleansing and war crimes conducted by Armenia. Their fundamental human rights were grossly violated. 4 United Nations Security Council resolutions adopted in 1993 demanded immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Armenian armed forces from the occupied territories. Sadly, these resolutions were never implemented. Armenia demonstratively ignored them because no sanctions were imposed on it by the international community. The OSCE Minsk Group, established in 1992 to facilitate a settlement, has failed in its mission. Instead of enforcing the norms and principles of international law, its co-chairs sought to preserve the status quo and keep the conflict frozen. In 2020, after almost 30 years of ineffective negotiations, Azerbaijan was forced to exercise its legitimate right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. During the war, Armenia shelled our towns and cities with ballistic missiles and cluster munitions, killing more than 100 of innocent civilians. Azerbaijan, in its turn, conducted the war in strict compliance with international humanitarian law. We ensured protection of civilians and refrained from targeting non-military infrastructure. In 44-day patriotic war, our armed forces liberated occupied territories and restored Azerbaijan's territorial integrity in accordance with international law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. The 10 November 2020 marked the capitulation of Armenia and restoration of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity after nearly 30 years of occupation. Right after our victorious war, Azerbaijan declared its readiness to open a new page in relations with Armenia, based on mutual recognition of territorial integrity and sovereignty. We proposed 5 basic principles rooted in international law. We tabled the proposal for a peace treaty. Then we initiated a negotiation process on its draft text, which lasted from October 2022 to summer 2025. Despite several attempts to derail the process, the negotiations produced positive results as they were conducted on a strict bilateral basis, free from any kind of external interference. On August 8 this year, the foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia in Washington, in the White House, in presence of the leaders of the United States, Azerbaijan and Armenia, initialed the text of peace agreement. The same day, the President of Azerbaijan and the Prime Minister of Armenia signed the joint declaration. President of the United States, Donald Trump, also signed it as a witness. Moreover, Azerbaijan and Armenia jointly appealed for the closure of the OSCE Minsk Group and related structures as an obsolete mechanism no longer relevant to the peace process. Accordingly, on 1 September, the OSCE adopted a decision to permanently close these structures. Regional connectivity has been at the core of our vision for lasting peace. Another key outcome of the Washington summit is the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, TRIP, which will ensure unimpeded access through the Zangezur corridor and foster regional connectivity. The recent Washington summit has also signaled a new phase in Azerbaijan-US relationship. Together with President Trump, we signed the Memorandum of Understanding between the two governments regarding the establishment of a strategic working group to develop a charter on strategic partnership between Azerbaijan and the United States. It opens new horizons for partnership in political, economic, energy, regional connectivity, defense, security, and other fields. The waiver by President Trump of the sanctions imposed on Azerbaijan in 1992 in the form of the Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act is a historic step as well. The permanent removal of Section 907 by the US Congress would eliminate a legacy of double standards and help strengthen trust and cooperation at a time when Azerbaijan is contributing to global security and stability. Overall, the agreements reached during my August visit to the United States carry historic significance. I want to express my gratitude to President Donald Trump for opening a new chapter in the US-Azerbaijan relationship, for his decision to elevate it to the strategic partnership level, and for his support to the peace process between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Right after the victory in the patriotic war of 2020, Azerbaijan started a large-scale reconstruction program in the liberated territories. During the time of occupation, Armenia leveled to the ground hundreds of Azerbaijani cities and villages, deliberately ruined 65 mosques. That was a policy of Armenia which was ruled by war criminals for almost 30 years. We are rebuilding villages and cities razed to the ground. Under the Great Return Program, already more than 50,000 people live, work, and study in the liberated territories. One of the gravest humanitarian challenges facing Azerbaijan in the post-conflict period is landmine contamination during the time of Armenian occupation. Since November 2020, more than 400 Azerbaijani civilians and military personnel were killed or seriously injured by landmine explosions. This massive contamination obstructs the safe return of displaced persons and delays reconstruction projects. Similarly, the tragic fate of nearly 4,000 Azerbaijanis who went missing during the Armenian aggression and occupation since the early 90s continue to require close attention and action. Ladies and gentlemen, coming to the global challenges we are facing, we believe that response must be inclusive, fair, and universal. Through its many initiatives, Azerbaijan has shown its clear commitment to advancing sustainable solutions. Azerbaijan is proud to have hosted COP29 last year, where we achieved important outcomes in advancing climate action, the green transition, and equitable access to financing. As a host of COP29, we guided negotiations towards ambitious and balanced outcomes, ensuring that all voices, particularly those of the developing world, were heard. The adoption of the new collective quantified goal at COP29, also known as Baku Finance Goal, is a historic milestone in global climate finance. This commitment brings previous $100 billion annual climate finance goal to at least $300 billion per year through 2035 from public sources in developed countries to developing countries. Azerbaijan also successfully finalized the long-awaited framework for carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, making the Paris Agreement fully operational 9 years after its adoption. Several key agreements were signed at COP29 to make the Loss and Damage Fund fully operational, providing critical support for vulnerable communities impacted by climate change. Being strongly committed to the green transition, we at the same time should not put unrealistic targets in front of us. The world cannot live without fossil fuels today and in foreseeable future. Energy security is closely linked to peace, regional connectivity, and economic development. Azerbaijan continues to play a proactive role in advancing these objectives globally. Azerbaijan has established itself as a reliable and indispensable partner in providing energy security to many countries. We play a strategic role connecting the Caspian region with international markets through diversified oil and gas pipeline systems. As of today, we are supplying natural gas to 14 countries. This ranks Azerbaijan as a top country in the world in terms of number of countries it supplies with pipeline gas. This reflects our strategic role in enhancing energy security and diversifying supply routes across Europe and beyond. Moreover, Azerbaijan and Syria have recently strengthened their bilateral partnership, focusing on energy supply, infrastructure development, and post-conflict reconstruction. Since August this year, Azerbaijan started to supply Syria
with natural gas via Turkey, significantly reducing its electricity shortages. Azerbaijan also attracts large investments in renewable energy sources, like solar, wind, and hydropower. Almost 40% of our energy will be generated by renewables by 2030. Connectivity projects like East-West and North-South corridors cross our country. We have witnessed almost 90% growth in cargo volumes through the Middle Corridor since 2022. The transit time along the corridor has been significantly reduced. The biggest trade fleet in the Caspian, Alat International Trade Port, with its annual capacity reaching 25 million tons in the near future. The Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railroad, 9 international airports, the biggest air cargo company in the region, and many other factors have turned Azerbaijan into one of international transport hubs. There is a great potential for cooperation in digital connectivity. Azerbaijan leads the Digital Transformation Initiative through such ambitious projects as the Digital Silkway. This project includes plans for the advanced fiber optic cable network under the Caspian Sea, establishing Azerbaijan as a key regional digital hub. Azerbaijan achieved significant economic growth by focusing on diversifying its economy beyond oil and gas, developing the non-oil sector and improving the investment climate through reforms and transparency. Reducing poverty and unemployment to the historic low of 5% is another achievement of our country. Recently, 2 major international rating agencies, Moody's and Fitch, have increased Azerbaijan's ranking. Azerbaijan was provided with favorable investment-grade status, citing very strong external balance, low public debt, and substantial sovereign wealth assets as a key strength. This underscores our economic resilience, strong fiscal discipline, and favorable investment climate. Our foreign debt is only 6.5% of GDP, which is one of the lowest in the world. Azerbaijan's foreign exchange reserves exceed its foreign debt almost 16 times. Back in 2022, at the summit of the Caspian littoral states, I raised the issue of environmental degradation of the Caspian Sea. Today's situation is much worse. Caspian Sea is shrinking rapidly. The main reason is not climate change. Joint efforts of littoral states are needed to stop ecological catastrophe with unpredictable consequences. Azerbaijan is also ready to cooperate closely with the UN to tackle this problem. Ladies and gentlemen, Azerbaijan is proud of its global humanitarian assistance efforts. We are providing aid to countries affected by natural disasters, conflicts, and public health emergencies. Azerbaijan contributed to the COVID-19 response, donating financing, protective equipment,
medical devices, and vaccines to more than 80 countries in need. Azerbaijan has entered a new era. We won both war and peace. We ended the occupation and started reconstruction. Justice has triumphed. Sovereignty has been consolidated, and peace is de facto reached. We stand prepared to share our positive experience. The achievements of the recent years are not only a victory and success of Azerbaijan, they are also a demonstration that international law must ultimately prevail. Our vision is clear: peace and development based upon international law, non-interference in internal affairs of states, mutual respect and cooperation. Let us together build a world without double standards, where justice is not selective, the rule of law is respected, and peace is achieved not through words alone, but through actions. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Zirkol Kohicic, Chairman of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Dear Chairperson, Secretary General, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. To start with the theme of this year's session of the United Nations General Assembly, Better Together, 80 Years and More for Peace, Development and Human Rights, allow me to express my congratulations to the United Nations from this important place on behalf of Bosnia and Herzegovina and all its citizens. The UN is celebrating 80 years since its founding, and at the same time 80 years of continuous work on the fundamental goal of this organization. That goal is to secure and maintain peace in the world. History will give the final judgment on how successful the UN has been in the past, as well as on the results of the work and participation of several generations in the United Nations itself, its bodies and organizations. At the same time, I believe it is important to clearly express our common position today. Peace in every part of the world has no alternative. We must continue to work together persistently on this. I would like to believe that we all share the same positive opinion, that we must protect peace in every part of the world. However, reality and what is happening today in different parts of our planet clearly show us that world peace is often not in the interest of certain geopolitical actors. For them, conflict or war is a means to realize their own political and economic interests. These interests largely diverge from the goals set out in the United Nations Charter. If we add to this the fact that attempts are being made to change the borders of state around the world by means of armed force in a manner that is contrary to the United Nations Charter, we can draw a simple conclusion. International law is not applied equally to all states that are subject of that very international law. We have been witnessing that in the past period, certain armed conflicts have been deliberately provoked. What follows is the use of significant armed force, which a state with a smaller or weaker armed forces simply cannot resist. After that, the attacked state is required to sit at the negotiating table and sign a waiver of parts of its territory, ostensibly in the name of peace, but in reality in the name of force. I believe that all of us in this room know that the United Nations Charter allows for the changing of state borders. However, this can only be done by voluntary agreement between states. Armed forces or political pressure backed by armed forces cannot be used. However, if armed force is used to force the other side to agree to an imposed agreement in which it loses part of its territory, then there is no good and sincere will. Only coercion is present, which is contrary to several acts of international law. In this particular case, I'm speaking of Ukraine and the pressures it is under as a sovereign state. These pressures require Ukraine to give up parts of its territory in order to achieve a supposedly lasting and sustainable peace. Are we, in this particular case, participants in a change in the world order? In such an order, peace is not set as the ultimate goal. On the contrary, war and armed force appear as a legitimate means to achieve the political goals of major geopolitical actors. Changing international borders through the use of armed force creates political pressure to force a state to give up parts of its territory. This creates a dangerous precedent in international law, which can easily become the rule. Ultimately, it means living in an unstable world in which peace no longer has value. This is certainly not the desired outcome. Such a thing cannot be justified by any provision of the United Nations Charter or other acts of international law. Today we have an equally unwanted situation in the Gaza Strip. There, such violence is perpetrated against the local population, which in its form indicates the existence of several elements of genocide, as established in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Let us recall, in addition to the fact that genocide represents the physical liquidation or removal of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group from a certain territory, it can also be committed in the event that such difficult living conditions are consciously imposed on that same national, ethnic, racial, or religious group that threaten to ultimately destroy that group completely in a certain territory. Ultimately, such an aggressive genocidal approach is used as a means to forcibly occupy and take over territory. Under international law, these territories cannot belong to those who initiate and produce aggression. However, this is exactly what is happening in the Gaza Strip today. In Gaza, the people of Palestine face these two elements of genocide prescribed by the aforementioned Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. A part of the world's political public closes its eyes and keeps silent about this extremely terrible fact. And there is no political interest or even economic interest motivated by the intention to exploit natural resources such as oil or natural gas in that part of the Mediterranean, which could justify such a high level of genocidal violence against the local Palestinian population. Such violence is unjustified and unacceptable. Equally unacceptable is the silence and occasional approval that comes from various political circles around the world. What kind of peace, development, or protection of human rights can we even talk about if this kind of violence is allowed? Violence with forms of genocide against the Palestinian people. Does something like that mean that the political interests of individual countries or the interests of corporate capital are stronger and more important than our common obligation to protect peace in every part of the world and the human rights of every individual in the world? This obligation is a prerequisite for the development and self-sustainability of various societies. This is a major challenge that we are facing today, and we cannot run away from that challenge. We must not continuously silence this interest for the sake of some high or opportunistic interests. Let us just remember the phrase, silence is actually an expression of either cowardice or approval of cowardice. Dear sir, allow me to briefly say something about my country, Bosnia and Herzegovina. A little more than 30 years ago, Bosnia and Herzegovina was faced with aggression coming from neighboring countries. At that time, the United Nations formed a peacekeeping military force called UNPROFOR, with the participation of countries that expressed interest in such endeavor. The role of UNPROFOR was such that they were, to a large extent, mere observers of a series of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and ultimately genocide committed by the aggressors of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, there were also positive examples of UNPROFOR's activities, which should certainly not be forgotten, and we are sincerely grateful for that. Unfortunately, a stain remains on that United Nations mission. Certain UNPROFOR commanders did not want to activate airstrikes in order to prevent ethnic cleansing, especially the genocide committed in Srebrenica in July 1995. Unfortunately, genocide was committed in Srebrenica. Hundreds of thousands of citizens throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina lost their lives during the aggression. Many more were injured, and more than 1 million citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina were displaced around the world. I would like to briefly remind you that the International Criminal Court in The Hague, established by these very United Nations, has found the guilt of several individuals for committing genocide, as well as the existence of a series of joint criminal endeavors. They all had the same goal, ethnic cleansing, with the creation of ethnically pure parts of the territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in order to separate these parts from Bosnia and Herzegovina and annex them to neighboring states. A little over a year ago, here at the United Nations, we worked together on the adoption of the resolution on the genocide committed in Srebrenica. I consider that a major step forward and an important document, not only for Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also more widely. The strength of that resolution lies in its intention to prevent the possible commission of some new genocides, which could happen anywhere in the world. Although we were faced with lobbying from several countries not to adopt such a resolution, it was nevertheless passed. This created a new environment of preventive action through a culture of remembrance, so that genocide, the most terrible war crime, would never happen again. This is when we realized that there were states that, for their own political reasons or political convenience, were not ready to support the text of that resolution. That text is based on the rulings of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which, I repeat once again, was founded by the United Nations. May such a refusal to support the text of the resolution serve to honor those who lobbied against its adoption and those who did not give clear support to the resolution. I would like to remind you that during that period, in the 90s, the international community, through the United Nations, imposed an embargo on Bosnia and Herzegovina on the purchase of defensive weapons. This prevented the defense of our country from double aggression. In any case, defense would significantly shorten the duration of the war, and many lives would have been saved, because a peace agreement would be reached much sooner. A necessary condition for a peace agreement was the creation of a balance of military power between Bosnia and Herzegovina and the two neighboring countries that committed the aggression. Due to that embargo, the aggression against Bosnia and Herzegovina lasted for almost 4 years, and a large number of human lives were unnecessarily lost. Such a war ended with the signing of the Dayton-Paris peace agreement. That agreement brought the necessary peace, and we are grateful for that. However, at the same time, it created such a sui generis political system in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which today, 30 days after its creation, poses a problem for the normal functioning of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Such a political system does not contain democracy, but a deviant form of democracy, a form that is unheard of in practice anywhere in the world. Ethnicity is put to the fore, and basic human rights are completely denied. At the same time, democracy is undermined to such an extent that it almost no longer exists. We can call this political system an incident political system, which is constantly destabilizing the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Why am I even mentioning democracy right here? For at least two reasons. The first reason is that states that opt for democracy and its principles should have the opportunity to fully implement that democracy within their own borders. We must be fully aware that there are a number of states that, for their own reasons, be it historical, cultural, or religious reasons, do not want democracy and its principles. Bosnia and Herzegovina has clearly opted for democracy and the transition from the previous political system to a new democratic political system. However, this is continuously being prevented in reality through elements of the political system established by the Dayton-Paris peace agreement. The second reason I mentioned is that after facing an embargo on the import of defensive weapons during the 90s, Bosnia and Herzegovina is now facing an embargo on democracy. Some actors from the international community are trying to ensure this through their political and diplomatic activities and resources. So after we had an embargo on defense, today we have an embargo on democracy and democratic development of Bosnia and Herzegovina. How else to explain such activity by that part of the international community? They're trying in various ways to ensure this incidental political system in which the minority governs the majority. This undermines one of the fundamental principles of democracy, which requires a system in which the political majority should actually govern the state. That is not the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The aforementioned actors describe this as an alleged distribution of political power between ethnic communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, that undermines democracy so much at its root that it almost no longer exists in my country. What does exist, however, is something simply called ethnocracy, in which a political minority rules the state. This current deviant political system makes this possible. Are such actors of the international community trying to ban or impose an embargo on democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina because of its demographic picture? Are they trying to create a situation to reopen talks on Bosnia and Herzegovina with an uncertain outcome for its existence within its current borders? These questions remain open. I would like to remind you here that without democracy, there is no rule of law. Without the rule of law, there is no protection of individual human rights. An argument for such action by a part of the international community may be the so-called Kovacevic case before the European Court of Human Rights. This case is unknown to you, perhaps unimportant to you, but it is extremely important to us in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is a case in which the appellant sought simple, justified and logical protection of his active rights to vote, which was denied to him. The case was resolved in favor of the appellant, Mr. Kovacevic, in the first instance. The court also found the existence of ethno-territorial discrimination. However, a part of the international community invested enormous diplomatic and financial efforts in its attempt to annul the verdict during the second instance proceedings. One of the countries, which is completely incomprehensible and unacceptable, made a financial donation to the European Court of Human Rights. That country later came forward in the same case as an interested party. This is an expression of classic political corruption. Because of all this, a logical question arises here. Can the judgments of international courts be bought? Are they for sale? The High Representative of the international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina actively participated in overturning that verdict. Also, he was not given such powers by the Dayton Peace Agreement. He also invested enormous financial resources from unknown sources. He did not have the necessary consent of the Peace Implementation Council for such actions. So, a completely identical situation occurred as with the adoption of the resolution on the genocide in Srebrenica. Some countries tried to negate the judgment of the International Criminal Court in The Hague by lobbying against the resolution. In the case that I am now citing as an example, some other countries tried and are still trying to annul the judgment through their own lobbying and broader diplomatic activity. This leads us to the conclusion that there is a part of the international community that simply does not allow democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Yesterday, we faced an embargo on weapons necessary for the defense of our country. Today, we have an embargo on democracy and human rights. Therefore, I would like to briefly remind you of another United Nations document called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This document guarantees, among other things, to vote and to be elected at periodic elections, which shall be held by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret ballot, with the guarantee of free expression of the will of each voter. Unfortunately, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we are not allowed to do this. The international community is making great efforts to preserve discrimination and to deny democracy. The result is the lack of the rule of law, as well as insufficient and almost no protection of individual human rights. The logical conclusion that arises is the following. Democracy, as well as the right to defend the country, are privileges whose application is determined and enabled by political elites from larger and richer countries. Small countries and poor countries can only receive as much democracy as those who are larger and richer allow them to get. That is certainly not an expression of equality that we should all strive for today. Here we come to the issue of human rights. To be more precise, I'm referring to the equality of every individual in their own country and beyond. This particularly concerns the right of every person to participate equally and as they wish in every aspect of social life in their country. We have a whole series of documents of acts of international law that guarantee such rights. This, therefore, raises an open question. Are we prepared to be consistent or persistent in protecting individual human rights in any part of the world, using the tools that the aforementioned international documents provide us with? Every issue of human rights protection begins with the fight against discrimination or any form of inequality of individuals in all their rights guaranteed to them by international law. The logical continuation of this are the documents or laws in different countries. Discrimination in any form is prohibited by international law. Unfortunately, very often we encounter situations where discrimination is silenced and even encouraged. Speaking from the perspective of Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have 5 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights that establish the existence of discrimination against citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina based on their ethnic origin or place of residence. Some of the political elites in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as part of the international community present in Bosnia and Herzegovina, do not want to accept these verdicts or implement them through constitutional amendments. Therefore, the 5 aforementioned judgments of the European Court of Human Rights have not been implemented. The aforementioned 6th judgment in the case seeking the rejection of ethno-territorial discrimination was overturned thanks to pressure, donations and similar actions by certain countries. The person who was authorized by the peace agreement to implement that very peace agreement and to protect all aspects of that agreement also participated in this. This includes all acts of international law that speak of human rights. All of this leads us to difficult questions and even more difficult answers. Are human rights and the protection of the same privileges of the larger and wealthier societies and states, while those that are smaller and poorer are consciously and internationally bypassed in the protection of human rights? It starts from the right to life, all the way to the right to equality and democracy. Finally, let me emphasize that we can only respond to all three open questions, which are the subject of this session of the United Nations General Assembly, through consistency and principled insistence on the protection of peace. Only in this way can we create the conditions for the unhindered development of societies in the member states of the United Nations and act together as active protectors of human rights in all parts of the world. Without that consistency on those issues, we will once again be just a group expressing concern over deviant phenomena in the world, such as wars, violent border changes, genocide and war crimes, denial of human rights. In fact, we will do nothing more than express our concern. The consistency I'm referring to means complete determination to confront various deviant phenomena in the world through the tools provided to us by international law. We must be resolute and unwavering in our intentions to protect the fundamental values of the United Nations without making any distinction between states as subjects of international law. Within this determination, I call upon you to do the following. Let us not differentiate between ourselves, dividing us into large and small countries, rich and poor. Together, as an organization, let us actively seek and facilitate solutions to all the outstanding issues that arise in the world. Peace is not a privilege. Peace is an obligation of all of us, which we must ensure at all times and in all places. Likewise, human rights are not a privilege. Human rights are a permanent civilizational obligation, which we must continuously fulfill. This is certainly an ongoing challenge, one that generations before us have faced and that generations after us will keep facing. Our mission is to leave them a better world than the one we live in now. Such a goal requires persistent and continuous active work. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Chairman of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We shall now continue the general debate. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Teodoro Ngoma Obiang Mangui, Vice President in charge of National Defense of State Security of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Excelentissima.
Your Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, President of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Heads of State and Government, Heads of Delegations, Excellencies, Your Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, I am honoured to take the floor on behalf of His Excellency Obiang Mbaso, President of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, to share with you my country's most dearly held convictions at this 80th session of the General Assembly, being held at a time in which the world is calling for a fairer, more equitable and effective international system. Madam President, 80 years ago, the founding states established this organization, aspiring to build a multilateral system based on cooperation, respect for international law, and the dignity of all human beings. This commitment was enshrined in the United Nations Charter. That charter remains a lodestar for states' collective action. Today, under the theme Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development and human rights, we celebrate important achievements. The UN, over these 8 decades, has been a universal forum for dialogue and a space for international cooperation. It has helped to avoid conflicts. It has supported decolonization processes. It has promoted sustainable development. And it has served to pique our moral conscience in service of human rights. However, this anniversary must serve as an opportunity for critical self-reflection. It would be a mistake to simply mark the anniversary and not to recognize the woeful shortcomings of our multilateral system. Excellencies, the peoples of the world trust in the United Nations to tackle the major challenges of our time. Armed conflicts, violence, climate change, growing inequalities, migration crises, cyber threats, and the lack of technological transfer are all some of these challenges. However, all too often, the response provided to those challenges has fallen short. The United Nations has been brought to a standstill by individual interests and straitjacketed by an institutional platform which no longer reflects the reality of today's world.
Talking about leaving no one behind becomes meaningless if millions remain marginalized in systems of dependency and exclusion. The Security Council, the body responsible for upholding international peace and security, is perhaps the clearest example of the extent to which the United Nations is out of step. 8 years after its inception, the UN's membership structure remains rooted in the geopolitical state of play we had in 1945, and not that we see in the 21st century. Consequently, the United Nations' legitimacy and representativeness are quite rightly called into question. Security Council reform is an urgent need. Without that reform, the Security Council will continue to be perceived as an exclusive club of historical privileges, powerless to respond legitimately to current threats. Africa is demanding what is hers by right: full and permanent representation on the most important security organ in the world. We want to see an international governance system which serves the interests of all of us, not those of an elite. We demand a Security Council which represents the world of today, not the world of yesterday. Let us take real steps forward towards collective action which is more democratic, more equitable and effective. If not, we risk finding ourselves with a United Nations which is increasingly on the sidelines and one which holds less and less weight in the international arena. Our commitment with this organization remains intact.
We believe in the United Nations. We believe in the strength of international law and the force it holds. we believe in international cooperation as the only way to address challenges which no nation, however powerful it may be, can resolve alone. Our commitment is not unthinking. Rather, it must be rewarded with results, reforms, and a UN that can move with the times. On this anniversary, we must recall that peace, development, and human rights are inextricable pillars. Peace is not sustainable without development. Development is false if it is not rooted in dignity and rights for all. As such, let us state here again that we remain steadfast in our support for Agenda 2030, despite the fact that we recognize difficulties and delays in its implementation. Agenda 2030 is a collective commitment which reflects our desire to build a world free of poverty, free of hunger, and with dignity for all. However, we have less than a decade to fulfill it, and the pace of progress is all too slow. Excellencies, climate change is the greatest threat of our age. The most vulnerable nations pay a disproportionate price for climate change. At the same time, major emitters drag their heels with commitments. Climate justice is not a token gesture. It is a moral and legal obligation. Equatorial Guinea also defends the principle of sovereignty between states. Every people has the right to design its own development model, free of interference and arbitrary sanctions, which undermine their independence. We must believe in a world of peace and create one, a world in which no country is considered an enemy for being the friend of another. Allow me to share with you a recent example of the contribution that Equatorial Guinea makes to international peace. The historic agreement reached with the Republic of Gabon on the sovereignty of the Mbanye, Cocoteras, and Conga Islands. For decades, His Excellency Obiang Basoro handled this dispute with patience and dialogue until it was resolved peacefully before the International Court of Justice. This case has not only created a historic precedent on the African continent, rather it demonstrates also that conflicts can be resolved in accordance with the spirit of the UN Charter and in line with states' political will. Excellencies, promoting human dignity is a shared responsibility. Equatorial Guinea reaffirms its commitment to the protection of the rights of the child and those of persons with a disability. Rights to food security, housing, drinking water, and the sovereign exploitation of natural resources are an inextricable part of human rights as a whole. Without dignity that comes through material comfort, freedom is an empty ideal. Faithful to the principles of an inclusive international community, we insist that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on the Republic of Cuba be lifted. Keeping such measures in place not only gravely affects the development of a sovereign nation, it also runs counter to the fundamental principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Excellencies, to conclude, allow me also to address businessmen and women. I wish to invite them to come and discover Equatorial Guinea as a safe destination and one which is very attractive for investment. Our country offers a climate of political stability, fiscal incentives, and a clear vision of the future through our 2035 development agenda. We encourage you to accompany us on this journey, a journey which will not only generate shared dividends, but which will also consolidate the inclusive and sustainable development of our nation. I thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Vice President in charge of National Defense and State Security of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. The Assembly will hear an address by Her Excellency Josephine Joseph Lago, Vice President of the Republic of South Sudan. I request protocol to escort Her Excellency and invite her to address the Assembly.
Madam President, Excellencies, Heads of States and Government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I bring you warm greetings and best wishes from my President, His Excellency Salva Kiir Mayardit, the President of the Republic of South Sudan. I also bring you greetings from the government and the people of South Sudan, a message of peace, unity, development, and unwavering commitment to global partnership. I wish to extend my sincere congratulations to you, Madam President, on your election to preside over the 80th session of this esteemed Assembly. I also express appreciation to the General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, for his steadfast commitment to advancing the principles and objectives of the United Nations. The theme of this year's session, Better Together, 80 years and more, for peace, development, and human rights, resonates with objectives and aspirations of our country. South Sudan is the youngest country in the world and the 193rd member of the United Nations. After 50 years of brutal armed liberation struggle, it gained independence in 2011. Unfortunately, 2 years later, the country descended into an internal civil war. With the support of regional and international community, a peace agreement was signed between the warring parties in 2018, known as the Revitalized Agreement for the Resolution of the Conflict in South Sudan. This led to the formation of the current revitalized transitional government of national unity, a coalition government comprising the warring parties, other peace partners, and stakeholders. The peace agreement has provisions on governance structure, security sector reforms, transitional justice mechanism, economic sector reforms, and Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The agreement also stipulates 35% affirmative action on women representation at the national, state, as well as local government levels. The presidency consists of a president and 5 vice presidents, 2 of whom are female, thus achieving 40% of female representation at the highest level of government. In the first phase, the unified forces have been trained, some of the forces have been deployed, and the rest are waiting deployment. The second phase of the security sector reforms is due to start imminently this October 2025. This will complete the second phase of the second protocol of the agreement. Other protocols, including public finance management reforms, are ongoing. Transitional justice mechanisms are in progress, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will be established under the auspices of the African Union. Although the implementation of the peace agreement has been slower than we would have wanted due to financial constraints, some of the members of the international community have been contributing in kind. On the whole, the implementation of the peace agreement is about 60% executed. The agreement has held for 7 years, and a relative peace has been attained, thus giving hope to our people. Many South Sudanese have returned from the neighboring countries and the diaspora and are rebuilding their lives and contributing to national development. Work is ongoing, including preparations for general elections in December 2026. Until recently, the permanent cessation of hostilities was observed and relative peace attained throughout the country. Climate change and environmental sustainability. South Sudan is one of the countries adversely affected by the impact of climate change, despite contributing minimally to global emissions. For the last 5 years, our country has suffered recurrent floods on the one hand and prolonged droughts on the other, thus contributing to crop failures, biodiversity loss, and mass displacement. These challenges intensify food insecurity, undermine livelihood support, and threaten social stability. In this regard, the government of the Republic of South Sudan calls on equitable and predictable climate financing to strengthen adaptation and resilience. The Paris Agreement and subsequent COP summits made commitments which must be honored. South Sudan requires support in technology transfer, capacity building, and foreign direct investment in national frameworks such as the South Sudan Development Plan, nationally determined contribution, and national adaptation plan. This support is essential to address the intertwined challenges of development and environmental. The community cannot afford to ignore climate injustice. Collective action is imperative for these challenges which transcend national borders to be addressed effectively. South Sudan has embarked on planting of 100 million trees by 2030, expanding renewable energy generation and strengthening water infrastructure with women, youth, and people with disabilities at the center of these efforts. Our commitments to sustainable development goals. At independence, South Sudan inherited rudimentary state structures and hardly any infrastructures such as roads, electricity. We inherited poor health care, inadequate educational infrastructure, abject poverty, and food insecurity. The SDGs are aligned to our national priorities. For example, each vice president is in charge of a cluster which includes governance cluster, economic cluster, service delivery cluster, infrastructure cluster, and gender, youth, and humanitarian cluster. Madam President, the 2030 Agenda remains a vital framework for peace and prosperity. South Sudan has made some remarkable progress in agricultural transformation, including commercialization and value addition, which will create jobs for women and youth, including in crop production, livestock, and fisheries. This will enable people to produce their own food rather than relying on imported foods. Our policy is, let us produce what we eat. And as a consequence, some states in our country now are self-sufficient in food production, which contributes eminently to reduction of poverty, thus the attainment of SDG 1 and SDG 2. In collaboration with our development partners, government is providing health care, building health care infrastructure, improving maternal and child care, raising awareness about communicable diseases, and providing vaccinations for diseases such as cholera, mpox, and malaria. Access to clean water and sanitation is being improved. As part of the health sector transformation program, we aim to attain universal health care for all in South Sudan. The recent pandemic outbreaks around the world revealed the urgencies of strengthening health systems and equitable vaccine access. South Sudan advocates for global health framework that prioritizes preparedness for pandemics and embraces health as a universal human right. In his latest statement to Parliament in June 2025, His Excellency President Salva Kiir Mayardit identified education as a key priority area for the government. There is improved enrollment in primary schools and secondary schools, and many young people are aspiring now to go to universities and colleges. Enrollment has risen from 300,000 to 2.1 million children, with gender parity in primary schools nearly achieved. This is a remarkable national achievement. There is focus on teacher education to improve the overall quality of education. Despite these efforts and achievements, 2.8 million of our children are still out of school. South Sudan has expanded programs to promote girls' enrollment and retention in schools while investing in technical and vocational skills training for women and youth. Our government would like to take this opportunity to appreciate all those countries that have offered scholarships for our young people to study in their countries, and those supporting girls' education in particular and vocational training to provide employable skills for our young people. But more clearly needs to be done. South Sudan is a young population. Over 60% of the population is under the age of 30 years. In any society, the youth are the future of the country and the future of the society. Our youth are a source of great pride. South Sudan's recent participation in the Olympics Games in Paris last year was a unifying moment for the people of South Sudan and Africa at large. South Sudan athletes showcased talent, discipline, and resilience, embodying the spirit of a nation determined to rise. Sports have become a powerful force for unity, inspiring hope, and bringing communities together across our young nation. The South Sudan basketball team emerged as the best team in the continent of Africa during the last Olympic Games and nearly beat the defending champion in the world. Since independence, and in line with the Transitional Constitution 2011 as amended, we have taken steps to integrate gender equality into our governance and development agenda. Notably, South Sudan has enshrined 30% of women participation in public life at all levels of government. In addition to the two female vice presidents, our cabinet, the national cabinet, and state cabinets comprises of 30% of female representation. And our speaker, the Speaker of the National Transitional Assembly, is also a female. We have adopted national gender policies to advance women's rights and are working to harmonize our laws with international commitments. Efforts have been made to address gender-based violence through new legislation and establishment of a special court. We have mainstreamed gender into the National Adaptation Plan and nationally determined contributions for climate change. We are committed to advancing women's economic empowerment by improving access to land rights and credit facilities while creating opportunities for women entrepreneurs. To achieve the SDGs, we must shift from commitments to action, emphasizing multilateral cooperation, fair trade, debt relief, and tailored support for fragile and conflict-affected states. South Sudan has been advocating for debt cancellation and the support of the international community to complement these efforts will be appreciated. Financing for development. Transforming aspiration into results require adequate financing. We urge developed nations to scale up contributions to the International Development Association, which plays a central role in protecting vulnerable populations, reducing poverty, and financing sustainable development in fragile states. South Sudan supports reforms of international financial institutions to enhance the representation of developing nations, ensuring that financing mechanisms align with objectives of development priorities. Together, we can build a more inclusive and just global financial system. Internal peace and security. We acknowledge the delays in implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. However, the government has renewed its political will and is accelerating key benchmarks, including the deployment of the unified forces, electoral legislation, and launching of national civic education campaigns. His Excellency President Salva Kiir Mayardit announced on several occasions that he will not take this country back to war. And this became a theme of our engagement to restore peace and stability in the country. We reaffirm our commitment to world peace and security. In South Sudan, peace and stability remain our highest priority. Since the 2018 revitalized peace agreement, government has been working to consolidate peace through implementation of the peace agreement, transformation of the governance system, and security sector reforms. Additionally, government is also engaged in promoting peace building at subnational and community levels using the principles of people-to-people peace initiatives. The civil society, women's group, youth group, and faith groups are all actively involved in peace-building activities supported by UNIMIS, the United Nations mission in South Sudan, among others. The security sector reform is progressing well. In phase one, the first batch of unified forces are already trained, as mentioned earlier. The second phase is ongoing. At the same level, the governments at state levels are disarming civilians to bolster security. The aim is to have one national army under one commander-in-chief, contrary to the current state of affairs where the country has several commanders-in-chief, which in itself is a source of insecurity. In general, there has been relative peace and security throughout the country, with the exception of the recent attack by the White Army militia associated with the first Vice President, Dr. Riek Machar, on South Sudan People's Defense Forces in Nasir, which led to his detention and the detention of the co-accused. This matter is now being handled legally, and it will take due process, with assurance of a fair trial in a competent court. The government is committed to following due process to achieve justice in this matter. It should be noted that the arrest of the first Vice President, Dr. Riek Machar, and his co-accused was not politically motivated, but had endangered the peace process and constitutional order in the country. Notwithstanding the legal proceedings, Dr. Riek Machar and others have been formally charged and presented to court. Their legal rights have been respected, including granting access to their legal team, and they appear on their behalf in court. South Sudan remains open to meaningful dialogue with other holdout groups. In this regard, the government is considering resumption of the Tumaini Peace Initiative and welcomes facilitation from regional and other partners. We urge regional and international communities to urge the holdout groups to renounce armed violence and engage in political dialogue. Furthermore, we appeal to the international community to continue supporting South Sudan's efforts and democratic process through provision of technical assistance, capacity building, and development support. It is worth mentioning that consolidating peace in South Sudan is not only vital for our people, but also for stability across the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, and beyond. Since our last statement to this General Assembly, South Sudan has embarked upon a transformative journey. We have launched the South Sudan Development Plan 2026 to 2036, a forward-looking 10-year blueprint to diversify our economy, fortify our institutions, and reduce reliance on oil. This plan is anchored in the principles of transparency, inclusivity, and resilience. It guides comprehensive reforms in public financial management and service delivery. We have initiated independent audits, strengthened procurement oversights, and recommitted ourselves to the fiscal reforms outlined in the 2018 Revitalized Peace Agreement. We are determined to foster a culture of integrity, accountability, and good governance. Determined to shift from oil dependency to a green, sustainable economy, South Sudan is investing in the future of its land and people. The Agriculture SME Grant Initiative 2025 now empowers farmers, agro-processors with vital tools, training, and market access. Our investment in irrigation, seed distribution, and post-harvest technologies are boosting productivity and strengthening food security. We have successfully established effective governance structures both at the national and local level, including establishment of relevant commissions such as the Constitutional Review Commission, the Judicial Review Commission, among others. The constitutional making process is in progress. Civic education and voter rights training have commenced and are progressing well. The National Bureau of Statistics will advise on options available for elections. The Political Parties Council has been established and has started registering political parties intended to contest in elections. Therefore, with these positive developments, the government of the Republic of South Sudan appeals for the removal of targeted individual sanctions and the arms embargo on South Sudan. Elections. According to the peace agreement, the transitional period must end with the conduct of general elections currently scheduled for December 2026. This will enable the people of South Sudan to democratically elect their leaders for the first time in the history of this young nation. His Excellency President Salva Kiir has reaffirmed the government's determination to deliver credible, inclusive, and peaceful elections. The establishment of electoral institutions, namely the National Election Commission, the Political Parties Council for registration of political parties, and voters' right education have been established. The Bureau of Statistics has been restructured to deal with the issues of census. The restructured Permanent Constitution Review Commission has been actively working to ensure that the country has a new permanent constitution by the time of the general election in December 2026. Civil society groups are being facilitated and have started civic education of the general public, especially among women and the youth. South Sudan is committed to promoting and protecting human rights. We are strengthening national institutions, promoting accountability, empowering women and youth. We have taken steps to integrate gender equality into our governance and development agenda, not forgetting the people with disability. Civil society is actively engaged in the promotion of human rights and civic education. We believe constructive engagement and dialogue are the best path for building resilient and just institutions. Some regional concerns. Madam President, South Sudan and Sudan share deep historical and economic ties, as well as the longest border in the region. For instance, South Sudan's oil is at the moment being transported through Sudan. Developments in Sudan directly affects development in South Sudan. Since the outbreak of conflict in Sudan in 2023, South Sudan has opened its doors for Sudanese refugees and returnees from Sudan. In partnership with the international aid agencies, we are providing humanitarian assistance, and we have also gone further and given plots of land for refugees to cultivate and produce their own food, thus integrating them into our local communities. However, there are still outstanding issues with respect to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement 2005. Among these are issues of border demarcation and final status of Abyei, including the status of the Ngok Dinka of Abyei, which remains unresolved. We are committed to working with the government of Sudan to amicably resolve these outstanding issues. Furthermore, the current composition of the Security Council no longer, in our view, adequately reflects the realities of today. And for this reason, South Sudan supports the call for the expansion of the permanent membership to include African representation. Furthermore, we advocate for the removal of sanctions and arms embargo on South Sudan and other sisterly countries. Madam President, at independence, South Sudan inherited rudimentary state structures, hardly any infrastructures. The government is now working simultaneously on nation building, state building, provision of services including healthcare, education, capacity building, poverty reduction, and food security. South Sudan is seeking to transition from humanitarian aid to development aid. What we are asking for is for the international community to continue supporting South Sudan, a country with immense potential, abundant natural resources, and a young population. We are actively empowering women and young people for the country to become a useful and productive member of the international community. And we are already seeing signs of progress. To conclude, Madam President, Excellencies, and distinguished guests, the United Nations was founded on the belief that humanity is stronger together. The theme of this 80th session, Better Together, is a reminder of our shared responsibility for survival and progress. Notwithstanding the challenges, South Sudan, with the resilience of its people under the leadership of His Excellency President Salva Kiir Mayardit, remains committed to a multilateral solidarity and partnership with an aim of building a fairer, safer, and more prosperous world for all, for us in South Sudan. It is, a more prosperous world for all. And for us in South Sudan, we all know that it is better together. It is better together for us nationally. It is better together for us globally. Permit me in closing to reaffirm our unwavering faith in the principles of the United Nations and the possibility of a better world, built upon solidarity and shared purpose. May God bless the people of South Sudan. May God bless the nations of the world. I thank you for listening. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Vice President of the Republic of South Sudan. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Mohamed Jal, the Vice President of the Republic of Gambia. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Your Excellency Annalena Baerbock, President of the 80th Session of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Majesties, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, Heads of Delegation, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. As we commemorate the 80th anniversary since the founding of the United Nations, it is with great honor and profound sense of commitment that I stand before you to deliver this statement on behalf of His Excellency, Mr. Adama Barrow, who could not be here due to circumstances beyond his control. At the outset, allow me to convey warm greetings and best wishes for a successful session from His Excellency, Mr. Adama Barrow, the President of the Republic of the Gambia, and government and people of the Gambia. Madam President, let me also use this opportunity to congratulate you on behalf of the government of the Gambia on your election as President of the 88th Session of the United Nations General Assembly. Your election is a testament to the importance our organization attaches to gender mainstreaming and the empowerment of women. It constitutes an affirmation that more than ever, women are capable of leading organizations like the United Nations and achieving remarkable success. The Gambia, therefore, assures you of its unwavering support and continued cooperation in the discharge of your duties while reaffirming our faith in the relevance of multilateralism and the sacrosanct foundational principles of the United Nations Charter. Allow me to seize this moment to also thank and congratulate Mr. Philomen Yang, President of the 79th Session of the General Assembly, for his leadership and for competently guiding the work of the Assembly during his tenure. The 80th Session of the General Assembly is being held at a very pivotal moment for the international community. The enormity of the challenges of managing and resolving various wars, conflicts, and ongoing threats to international peace and security require all member states to reaffirm their collective commitment to abiding by the noble principles stipulated in the United Nations Charter. The Charter, crafted with great optimism and anchored in the ideals of maintaining and promoting world peace, security, human rights, and development, promise a new age and a new world. A world that comes together to reverse the hurdles of the past and define a common destiny premised on our shared humanity. Let us rekindle the ethos of solidarity through more multilateral engagement with all states, small or big, developed or developing, fight poverty, and address climate change. Madam President, the 80th Session of the General Assembly conveys a profound symbolism for the Gambia. Our long-standing commitment to the United Nations and our election as chair of the second committee during this session is not only historic, but speaks to the great strides we have been making towards shaping a stable and prosperous multilateral global order. Let me assure you that the Gambia will continue its active participation in the work of the Assembly. We remain committed to supporting optimal ways in the search for innovative and timely solutions to the common challenges facing us, and would collaborate with all member states as we address these pressing global challenges. Madam President, in 1945, the world stood united with a deep sense of solidarity, strong commitment, and an enduring hope to establish the United Nations to save the succeeding generation from the scourge of war. The creation of the United Nations served as a driving force for multilateralism by affirming our collective faith in the sanctity of human rights while guaranteeing international peace and security to all peoples around the world. Our collective security arrangements were rooted in multilateralism. Our commemoration of the founding of the United Nations this year is a clarion call to the future, a reaffirmation of its fundamental role as a premier global institution entrusted with the destiny of humanity towards prosperity, peace, security, and human rights. Madam President, last year our Assembly adopted the Pact of the Future to revive multilateral engagement and rekindle global solidarity. We must do more to fulfill the commitments that we assured under the Pact. 80 years on, the world is still encountering the challenges of protracted conflicts and geopolitical fragmentation, including the threat to the spirit of multilateralism under the United Nations. As the world continues to grapple with complex and unprecedented challenges on different fronts, the peace and security landscape of our world is becoming increasingly fragile. Amid the changing nature of conflicts, we are also witnessing a serious disregard for the principle of international humanitarian law in conflict zones. What is even more profound is that the rules-based international order is under enormous stress, losing its momentum, relevance, and moral underpinnings. Today, we live in a world that is undergoing profound geopolitical transformation, presenting unique emerging challenges and reflecting an international community that is still trying to find answers to the challenges it faces in the 21st century. However, despite the challenges we are confronting, the Gambia believes that the United Nations' enduring relevance and structural institutions contributed to significant historic achievements in the past, particularly for countries in the global south. The United Nations holds forth the hope for global stability and good governance by translating ambitions into actions and championing issues of immense international importance. In the case of the Gambia, the United Nations used its convening power and preventive diplomacy through the Peace-Building Commission to support a democratically elected government that assumed power in 2017. The support was key to upholding the will of the Gambian people as they assured in the present government and launched our transitional justice system to promote the rule of law and respect for human rights. Madam President, as we assemble and reflect on this important and timely theme for this 80th session, Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development, and human rights, we must admit that the daunting challenges we are facing today require us to deliberately invest in sustainable development, climate action, peace, and security. We must equally continue to foster resilience and growth for the realization of inclusive development and shared prosperity for all. Since the change of government in 2017, the administration of His Excellency President Adam Barrow had strived towards a path of development, peace, and respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. 8 years ago, we set out to build a stable and viable country, making sure national development agenda. With our current reform agenda that is inclusive, the Gambia is eyeing a future without the realm of immense potential and possibility. By addressing the grievances of the past through the implementation of recommendation of the Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission. In the past 8 years, the government has also organized several elections in a credible, impartial, and transparent manner, in line with domestic laws and international norms and standards, and plans are on for holding presidential elections next year. We are committed to consolidating participatory democracy, sustainable development, and good governance, as we have done for the past 8 years. Madam President, in our drive for greater reform, the government of the Gambia will continue to take the appropriate people-driven and informed policy decisions to strengthen institutions and design processes aimed at promoting and protecting human rights as well as addressing past violations. As we look forward to consolidating building strong state institutions and reinforce the never-again principle, the government is ushering in legislative reforms and expanding the scope of our criminal jurisdiction to prosecute international atrocity crimes. Since reforms include the enactment of the Special Prosecutor's Office, Act 2024, giving that office the mandate to deal with offenses that constitute international crimes and serious rights violations, and for the first time, the enactment of an Anti-Corruption Act, a significant step towards the organization of an Anti-Corruption Commission. These are all part of our national efforts to deliver restorative and transformative justice, build a clear path towards nation building, and lay a foundation for social justice, as well as prevent impunity. Our goal is to consolidate and nurture a more national culture of accountability and respect for human rights in fulfillment of our domestic and international obligations. To support our national development ambitions as enshrined in our National Development Plan, we continue pursuing a national budgeting mechanism that is grounded on human development, fiscal stability, education, and building critical infrastructure to promote development and investment. Madam President, our primary social contract with the Gambian people is to meet the demands of our socio-economic challenges whilst at the same time encourage citizen participation and engagement in democratic governance. This propels us to ensure that our democracy continues to thrive, respect for fundamental rights robust, expansive, and comprehensive, and the building of institutional mechanisms. In building a peaceful society, we continue to recognize the integral role of women and their representation and participation in political affairs and public life. We also continue to promote media freedom and the right to assembly and freedom of expression as guaranteed inherent rights through coordinated and sustained actions. As a government, we encourage constructive engagement with our citizenry, particularly the young people, and respect their rights to participate in democratic functioning of the state. In view of our own experience with governance challenges, we value the need for addressing the consolidation of democracy and good governance in our neighborhood. It is in this spirit the Gambia recently hosted the Sahel Governance Forum, which seeks to galvanize a multi-stakeholder convergence to address the governance challenges that continue to hamper regional peace, stability, and development. We are confident that such forum will provide the right opportunity for systematic discussion on finding definitive solutions to the rising tide of violence, insecurity, and instability of the Sahel. Madam President, with its strong commitment to the promotion and protection of international peace, security, and human rights, the Gambia continues to be a member of the African Union Peace and Security Council, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and a police and troop contributing country to UN, AU, and ECOWAS peacekeeping missions around the world. By serving on this important council of the continent and taking part in peacekeeping operations, the Gambia continues to prioritize the maintenance of international peace and security, including the consolidation of political and democratic governance and strengthening partnership for African security. It is significant that the African Union and the United Nations continue to work together to address regional peace and security matters, including the recalibration of our preventive diplomacy tools for maximum impact. We need to strengthen the early warning mechanisms as well as prioritize the protection of children affected by armed conflict. Madam President, by echoing the mantra of the Africa we want and an Africa at peace with itself, the Gambia believes that more needs to be invested towards conflict prevention as part of efforts to respond robustly to challenges of insecurity and underdevelopment, particularly through resilient building. We call on the United Nations Security Council to step up and meet its responsibility towards the resolution of conflicts in Africa and beyond. The rising level of inequalities are indicative of the unequal global economic system, creating huge imbalances for countries in the global south, particularly in Africa, to address poverty, debt, and unemployment. It is indeed disheartening that 5 years towards the end of the targeted Agenda 2030 deadline, much remains to be accomplished and the realization of its goals and ambitions appear to be profoundly remote. Madam President, in 2025, when the world should be forging towards a path of development and prosperity, we are once again confronted with the scourge of more conflict and war. Therefore, the 2025 Peace-Building Architecture Review presents a unique opportunity to agree on building stronger preventive arrangements and measures for conflict prevention. The ongoing conflicts raging around the world would need to stop immediately. The unnecessary deaths, displacement, and untold suffering of civilians from Palestine to Sudan, Lake Chad Basin, Ukraine to Russia, Haiti, Libya to the Sahel, and in other corners of the world is unacceptable. As members of the United Nations and as conscientious global citizens, we cannot relent on our collective quest for durable peace. We must continue to pursue responsive and purposive actions by exhorting the parties to the conflicts and make progress on key milestones on their journey to political dialogue. We must all assist by putting in necessary security arrangements and frameworks for ending conflicts, including the protection of civilians, particularly women, children, and the elderly. Parties to the conflicts must allow immediate and uninterrupted humanitarian aid to reach the suffering population, and they must commit to ending the hostilities. It is the responsibility of the international community to collectively muster the necessary political will and courage to end intractable conflicts. The bleeding must stop. Madam President, as we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, the plight of the Palestinians remains unresolved, with the people continuing to face alarming difficulties under dire humanitarian conditions. The situation of Palestine continues to be about the core principles of justice, respect for international humanitarian law, and self-determination. The ongoing situation needs to stop. We cannot remain unperturbed by these worsening conditions, and it is imperative that we act urgently and collectively by utilizing our leverage to revitalize the prospects of an inclusive peace process for Israel and Palestine and the region. In this context, we reaffirm our call for the two-state solution to urgently enable the Palestinian people to regain their legitimate national rights as recognized by the international community through its recognition of the State of Palestine within the 1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. We also support the membership of the Palestine in the United Nations. In this spirit, we express our appreciation to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and France for the recently concluded high-level conference on the question of Palestine. Madam President, as part of our call for proactive engagement towards the resolution of global conflicts, the government affirms its support for the efforts undertaken by UN Secretary General in launching the roundtable process in the Moroccan Sahara to achieve a realistic, pragmatic, and sustainable political solution to the regional dispute over the Moroccan Sahara. The government welcomes Morocco's commitment to the ceasefire, full cooperation with ISRO, and relaunching the political process based on the parameters of Resolution 2756 of 2024. In this regard, we call on Polisario to abandon its unilateral withdrawal from the ceasefire, lift restrictions imposed on the freedom of movement and the provision of supply to MINUSO, and urge all parties, Morocco, Algeria, Mauritania, Polisario, to work towards a realistic, pragmatic, and sustainable political solution based on compromise. The positive impact of the Moroccan Autonomy Initiative, a realistic, credible, and serious effort for the settlement of this regional dispute, is already well recognized, and the people of the region continue to enjoy peace and development and protection of their human rights. Thanks to the government of the Kingdom of Morocco's new development model for the Moroccan Sahara region. Furthermore, the government also lauded the launch by His Majesty Mohammed VI, King of Morocco, of the Morocco-Nigeria gas pipeline, the Atlantic African Initiative, and the Sahel countries' access to the Atlantic. The three regional royal initiatives would give new impetus to the Moroccan Sahara region by establishing it as a new platform for security, stability, and co-development in the Atlantic, the Sahara, African, and Mediterranean areas. Madam President, the government also continues to stand with the government and people of the People's Republic of China on the One China policy. China's commitment to international cooperation and support for the critical spaces of development in different sectors demonstrate that the sustainable development of South-South and triangular cooperation are possibilities. The government continues to reiterate the call for the lifting of economic embargo against the brotherly people of Cuba. The embargo continues to inflict undue hardship and economic devastation, occasioning substantial challenges for the government and people of Cuba. We believe it should come to an end now. Friendly cooperation is the way forward. Madam President, as we mark 25 years since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, we should take a moment to renew our firm conviction that the attainment of sustainable development and the consolidation of peace and security are anchored in the full and inclusive representation of women in all spheres of political and decision-making processes. While considerable progress has been made towards the realization of women's inclusion, women's participation in the consolidation of peace and security, there continues to be significant impediments that we must overcome. Women must always have a seat at the negotiating table. They usually bear the brunt of conflicts. Therefore, as we prepare for the Fourth World Conference of Women, and as nations sharing the same destiny, we have a moral obligation and a collective responsibility to act swiftly to address all issues hampering the empowerment of women, including institutional advancement and their contribution to the consolidation of peace and security. Madam President, In view of the outcome of FFD4, it is our hope that international financial architecture and mechanism will change for the better, as the current international financing architecture, especially as it relates to debt restructuring, continues to hamper the development aspirations of developing countries. Due to limited fiscal space exerted by debt distress, developing countries find it hard to make significant investment in the social sector. The challenge is even more profound when it comes to investment in the productive base of their economies to engender growth, employment, and development. This situation significantly contributed to the dismal attainment of only 17% of the SDGs. Therefore, to accelerate the full and effective implementation of the SDGs within the targeted framework, we must enhance international finance cooperation and review of the international financial architecture to create arrangements, facilities, and mechanisms that would cater for targeted investments, industrialization, mechanized agriculture, provision of quality education, energy, health, and water. Madam President, the Pact of the Future adopted last year at the 79th session of the General Assembly presents a unique opportunity to review our realities, invigorate the implementation of the SDG Agenda 2030, and intensify our efforts towards confronting the pressing challenges of our time. The Pact is about advancing our advanced prosperity. The Gambia supports the convening of the preparatory process for the review of the Pact in 2028 to align effectively with the prevailing and upcoming intergovernmental processes such as the 2025 Peacebuilding Architecture Review, the high-level plenary meeting to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the World Programme of Action on Youth, and the World Social Summit. The success of these reviews will depend primarily on our commitment and concerted push to build a more equitable and resilient global governance framework that supports the attainment of our global goals. Madam President, our reform agenda is still incomplete without reform of the Security Council. The Gambia supports the reform of the United Nations Security Council and the Common African Position on the reform of the Council as set out in the CIRT Declaration and the Isilwini Concession. We strongly believe that the ongoing review and reform process of the United Nations needs to make good progress, and Africa's underrepresentation in the permanent and non-permanent categories of the Security Council is a historical injustice that urgently needs to be corrected. Africa has always contributed to global peace, and Africans also paid the ultimate price during the two world wars. Hence, the Gambia believes that the time has come for the international community to support Africa's call for meaningful representation in the Security Council. The reform of the Council guarantees its legitimacy and credibility as the body responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. We commend the AU Committee of 10 heads of state and government on the United Nations Security Council reforms, chaired by His Excellency President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, for their leadership in this legitimate quest. Madam President, as the world continues to witness heightened level of insecurity, the threat of climate change continues to aggravate security challenges, especially in the Sahel. We must address the impact of the climate crisis as part of the vital resilient measures that mitigate climate-related risks where they intersect with political, social, and economic factors. The Gambia would like to acknowledge the progress made at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, for moving from $100 billion to the new collective quantified goal, which is still not adequate to finance all the mitigation and adaptation actions, especially for countries in special circumstances. We need to take concrete decisions at COP30 in Belém, Brazil, to galvanize support for more climate financing. The Gambia calls for more ambitious, nationally determined contributions by all states due to their submission this year to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Madam President, as I conclude, allow me to call on member states to use this 88th session of the General Assembly to forge a new consensus to confront our new reality, a consensus that unites us behind our shared determination to make the United Nations a potent instrument to serve our common purposes and aspirations as one human family. This is our only planet. Let us preserve it for posterity. The Gambia is ready to play its part in making our world a better place for all. On behalf of His Excellency President Adama Barrow, the government and people of the Gambia, I wish you all fruitful deliberation towards advancing the theme of the 88th session of the General Assembly. I thank you for your kind attention.
En nombre de la Asamblea.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Gambia.
Doy ahora la palabra